$3 billion. You heard it right. That is the amount Sequoia Capital made by investing just $60 million in WhatsApp. When the founders Brian Acton and Jan Koum went with their ideas of WhatsApp to Sequoia Capital, Jim Goetz actually gave the nod. Over the next few years, Sequoia Capital invested $60 million on WhatsApp and was the only investor. So after the business skyrocketed and WhatsApp became the most downloaded app on the phone, it was all success. Finally, as we all know, WhatsApp was sold to Facebook for a whopping $19 billion, and Sequoia Capital ultimately made very close to $3 billion. And that's a classic example of a private equity success story. And that's what the topic of the day is. So we will discuss the nuts and bolts of private equity, what it means, how it works, etc. Hi all, my name is Dheeraj Vaidya from wallstreetmojo.com, the home for most authentic place to learn finance and accounting. So without wasting much of your time, let's get started. First thing first, what is private equity? Private equity is nothing but a financing method that helps private companies or startups to acquire funds for a long term. By this way, they don't have to rely on these traditional ways of fundraising like the IPOs or the bank loans, etc. And what does the private equity firm get in return? They basically take ownership of the company as such. And these private equity firms not only invest in the company, but they also make use of the resources and the knowledge that they have, the business insights that they have, the connections that they have basically to make these companies grow. The ultimate objective of these private equity firms is to boost companies' growth to an extent that it can go public or can get acquired by larger entities. So if this happens, this will result in massive gains for that private equity firm. So think of it like this. Let's assume that you have a very talented friend, but unfortunately he cannot afford the college tuition money. You tell him that, hey buddy, I have money. I'll invest in you and pay for all your tuitions and help you succeed in life. But when you start doing awesome, we will start sharing your earnings. I know this sounds opportunistic, but I'm just trying to explain you the underlying concept of private equity. Now let us zoom into the structure of a private equity firm. These firms have two types of partners. The first one is called as a general partner and the other one is called as a limited partner. What's the difference between the two? The general partners are nothing but the investment managers. Think of them as running day-to-day operations of a private equity firm. And what's their job? They basically invest in companies, right? So basically they look at what investments to make and they manage the funds. On the other hand, limited partners are primarily wealthy investors, insurance companies, it could be labor unions, university endowments, etc. In a typical private equity fund, the general partners contribute 1 to 2% of the overall fund size, and the remaining comes from the limited partners. So think of it like this. If the fund size is $500 million, this $5 million to $10 million will be contributed by the general partners or the GPs, while the remaining will come from the LPs or the limited partners. Why do the limited partners invest so much amount of money? They expect great returns, of course. And these funds are locked in for a certain period of time. Usually it is like 5 to 7 years. And once they're okay with it, they kind of sign a limited partnership agreement, and there's something called a private placement memorandum or the PPM. So these are nothing but legal documents that kind of mentions the terms and the conditions with respect to the kind of investments that the private equity fund will make and the kind of profit sharing agreements that they have. After collecting the desired funds, the general partner's job actually starts, and they start looking for investments in various private companies that have excellent potential to grow. So they go through all the portfolio of companies and they start investing. The private equity firm actually analyzes three most important aspects before investing. The very first one is basically how big is the business opportunity. Number two, which kind of markets are they planning to enter? And number three, sometimes it becomes the most important, that is management team. So let's say if the private equity fund is all excited about the portfolio company, they are very happy with the growth potential. The next step is to structure the investment deal. So this is where basically the terms and conditions between the private equity firm and the portfolio company is kind of laid out. And this is called as nothing but the term sheet. And this is where, both the parties, the portfolio company and the private equity company, then both of them, when they agree, a deal is kind of finalized. In fact, in most cases, you'll also find there's something called an anti-dilution option that is introduced by the firm. This basically means that the private equity company's ownership will be kind of protected, even when, let's say, the portfolio company issues, goes for further investments at lower valuations. So let's say once everything is agreed upon, it's time for the private equity fund to invest in that company. The investment of a private equity fund can actually occur in many stages. It could be a startup phase, it could be a maturity phase, it could be also a decline phase. Let's say when the investment is made in a very, very nascent stage, it's basically called as a venture capital. Here, let's say there's no product, there's just an idea. So that's what is called as venture capital. Think of WhatsApp. It got its investment through venture capital. But let's say if the investment is made in an established company with sustained revenue and cash flows, it's termed as growth capital. So the first one was venture capital, here it is called as growth capital. And in some cases, in fact, the private equity funds also invest in distressed companies who are basically on the verge of bankruptcies. Such companies might have issues in paying their financial commitments. And yes, you heard it right. The private equity firms actually make such investments. So in this case, what happens is the private equity firm basically buys all the shares of the distressed company. And let's say if it was listed, it will delist it as well. And it starts making substantial improvements. So basically they tap into their own management network, management team, expertise, knowledge. They put everything into that company and they try to, bring it back from the verge of bankruptcy. So the idea is to sell it at a much, much higher price. So this seems interesting, right? But again, it's full of risks. Such transactions are usually called as the leveraged buyouts or the LBOs. Why they are called as LBOs? Because, these investments are completely, financed by taking leverage, that is the debt from the bank. So the private equity firm invests a part of it as a form of equity, and the remaining portion actually comes from debt. So that's why it's called as a LBO. Just remember that this is one of the most riskiest transactions, but again, since it's leveraged, the returns are pretty high for the private equity firm. Now let us look at the overall life cycle of a private equity fund. So it's basically divided into three different stages. The first and the foremost stage is basically the collection or the fundraising stage. So this is where the private equity firm actually accumulates the required funds from the various limited partners. So we discussed this earlier, right? The general partners are the ones who operate and the limited partners are the ones who invest, right? So the limited partners like the endowment funds, insurance companies, these are the ones who invest in private equity firms. And they usually invest for a longer period of time, like 5 to 7 years. The next stage is basically the investment period. At this time, the general partners actually invest in the portfolio companies that have tremendous growth potential. And usually the investment period is around 3 to 5 years. So you remember we discussed this earlier, the private equity firm as well as the portfolio companies, they work together. So the private equity firm, they leverage into their expertise and networks and they help the portfolio company grow. So once, let's say, the portfolio company achieves their desired growth and size, the final stage is nothing but the exit. So this is where the private equity firm starts looking for the right investor and the right time to sell their ownership. And this is done across all the portfolio companies. And once this is done, the fund is closed. Overall, the general partners of private equity firm take almost 2% of the fund size as management fees and another 20% of the profit over and above the hurdle rate. Now think of hurdle rate as the minimum return that the PE firm has kind of committed to in the limited partner agreement. So once they achieve this kind of a return, only then will they get the 20% profit. The remaining is basically distributed to the limited partners, and this is how basically the private equity firm works. They basically invest in the business, they grow it, and they reap the benefits along with the company. Let us see these stages in the case of WhatsApp. The very first stage was when Secure Capital actually collects its funds from limited partners like the endowment funds, insurance companies, wealthy investors, right? So that was the first stage. The second stage is when Secure Capital makes its investments in WhatsApp and its growth. So the first part was, they invested around 8 million initially, and then they invested another 50 million over the years. So that was second stage. The third was basically the exit when Facebook actually acquired WhatsApp for $19 billion. So this is where Secure actually made around 3 billion on its overall investment of $60 million. So it gave them a cool return of 50 times. But you should remember that in some cases it might not work out the way it is in WhatsApp. The invested portfolio company may not perform at all and burn a big hole in the pockets of a private equity firm. I hope you found this video to be useful. Please do like and share. And if you have any feedback or want to suggest a topic for any future videos, then you may do so by writing about it in the comments section. Also, we come up with interesting videos on finance and accounting topics regularly. So if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, then please do so by clicking on the subscribe button below so that you can get the notification about our latest videos as soon as we release one. Thank you for watching. Have a nice day.